ready. Record to the cloud. Okay, we can begin.
Okay, well, good morning or afternoon to everyone who is joining us to the second day of the Global Equiano event and our second live talk. We just had a wonderful keynote by Dion Brand. And now we are so lucky to have a conversation between Professor Nicole Aljoe and artist Joy Labinjo. And by the way, I'm Kate Singer, and I am helping to organize with the Early Caribbean Society. So I want to say a few words, and then I'm going to introduce our conversants today. So within the politics of recognition and misrecognition, we know how tremendously violent the technologies of the visual can be, and also how powerful a resistance, as Dion Brand was just telling us, as they offer us places to reside in and feel with. We were talking yesterday about the depth of detail in Equiano's narrative, as well as the allegorical shocks that he sketches to trace the weight of nearly unbelievable situations. Something of that combined allegorical weight and caring attention to detail resides in Joy Labinjo's work, which we are so grateful to see and hear about today. In a conversation with one of our wonderful early Caribbean scholars, Nicole Aljoe, whose work on digital and historical archives has changed the way we understand narrativity and representation in the period, and more generally. So let me introduce them to you now, and just turn to give thanks to some of our sponsors. A special thanks to Amherst College and Mount Holyoke College for their support of this particular event, but more broadly to the Early Caribbean Society, Alex and Carrie and Dacia's unending labor in bringing this amazing event to fruition, the Keats Shelley Association and University of Winnipeg, and also University of Edinburgh's Futures Institute. So Nicole Aljoe is professor of English and Africana Studies at Northeastern University. Her research focuses on 18th and early 19th century Black Atlantic and Caribbean literature with a specialization on the slave narrative in early novels. Currently, she is at work on two new projects that extend this research in productive ways. The first examines representations of Caribbean women of color produced in Europe and England between 1780 and 1840, and the second explores relationships between narratives of Black lives and the rise of the novel in Europe and the Americas in the 18th century. Joy Labinjo's large-scale figurative paintings often depict intimate scenes of historical and contemporary life, both real and imagined, and often based on figures appearing in personal and archival imagery that include family photographs, found images, and historical material. In the past, she has explored themes including, but not limited to, identity, political voice, power, Blackness, race, history, community, and family, and their role in contemporary experience. Her work presents fresh and arresting compositions of color, pattern, and motifs, key signatures of Labinjo's work. Fundamentally, at the heart of Labinjo's practice is a bold interest in storytelling, people's lives, a retelling of history, and historical event. Labinjo was awarded the Woon Art Prize in 2017. Her acclaimed commission for the Brixton Underground Station in London, UK, 5 more minutes, was on view throughout November 2022. Recent exhibitions include The Body Electric, Larson Warner Gallery, Stockholm, Sweden, Beloved, Take What You Need, Tawani Contemporary, London, Real Families, Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge, and many, many others in the Netherlands, South Africa, Lagos, Nigeria, Morocco, and of course in London. So without further ado, please welcome Nicole and Joy.
Thanks so much, Kate, for that lovely introduction. Thanks also to Alex Milsom, Carrie Sinanan and Desha Osborne for organizing the conference. And obviously, thank you to Joy for consenting to participate in the conversation. So I'm super excited about this conversation. I had the great pleasure of meeting Joy in person 2 years ago when I was in London. So happy to have this opportunity to catch up. And so I thought we might start at the beginning. And so maybe talk a little bit about your training and because your background is incredibly interesting and plays such a large role in the work that you do. So I was wondering if you could start by talking about your experiences at maybe Newcastle and Oxford, what was some of your initial inspirations? And then maybe, as you wrap up, thinking about whether they might have remained the same or changed as time has gone by.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So yes, like Nicole said, I studied at Newcastle University between 2013 and 2017. I had a major push and pull between deciding to study art at university or doing something more, I don't know, academic, you could say. But in the end, I just chose to follow my instinct and my gut and what I was passionate about. So before that point, art had just been a subject in school that I really loved and enjoyed. I was introduced to art through painters such as Lucian Freud and Jenny Saville, and I was completely infatuated with them. They're both white figurative painters. I was 18 when I started at Newcastle University and was like basically the only Black student. And up until that point, I hadn't really considered race. Like I knew I was Black, part of a Black family. I lived in a town just outside London that was really diverse. And, being Black wasn't really something I thought about. I just kind of was. But being in a space where I was basically the only Black person, I was kind of confronted with race and how I was seen in ways that I hadn't really thought about before. At the same time as kind of having these thoughts, I was in art school, really enjoying my experience, being introduced to so much information and art history, loving it. Sorry, but I realized I wasn't taught about any Black artists. And this wasn't something I realized until my third year out of 4. And that was because I was just enjoying everything that I was being taught so much. And it was just new information and really exciting. But I did begin to realize that the course was very whitewashed. And I was also feeling that everything had been done. I didn't know where I fitted in. It felt like all of figuration had been discovered and a lot of my thoughts were existential. At the same time as learning more about painting and really understanding what it was. I would say that I really loved my course, but it wasn't until year 3 that things finally started to fit together. I learned about the Black British artists in a lecture and decided to do my thesis on those artists, including Sonia Boyce, Claudette Johnson, Labinjo Hamid. That was really an awakening, and it transferred to awakening in my practice as well. I went home for a break and left with a family photo album, not really knowing what I was going to do with it. But it gave me access to multiple Black figures and the archive, so to speak. And that was the beginning of my practice. A lot of things coming together. I would say for the first 3 years, I was just kind of running around like a headless chicken, not really having a clue, considering dropping out. But it was really the last 2 years where things kind of came together. I began to see myself and realize that I could just make art about my life, my existence, and it wasn't boring. And it had a place. In Oxford, where I did my master's, I was maybe 24 when I started, so 3 years after graduating, and I was a lot more sure of myself. I wanted to go and do a master's to learn more about critical theory that I really hadn't had access to on my BA, and just kind of fine-tune my skills. Their race was spoken about a lot more and very comfortably. The course was really diverse. Like actually, international with students from America, China, all over. And that was really enriching. Also, we were a lot older and everyone wanted to be there and wanted to learn. So I would say that was maybe a better experience, but I think age played a big part in that.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. That's so interesting to hear about how it sounds like, that one lecture kind of created a spark, and then you
Yes.
kind of went, into your own kind of family, your own connections. And so was it a matter of kind of like self-education? Were you kind of going to other, art exhibits and conversation with, some of your colleagues and faculty? What was the process of your awakening at this moment like?
I would say it was pretty much all self-led.
Yeah.
I was
Okay.
actually studying in Vienna at the time on Erasmus
Mhm.
whilst writing my thesis, but there weren't any books about what I was studying. So I got what I could online, came back to Newcastle to get more books. And there was an art historian who had just started, who made a real effort to lead me in the right direction and introduce me to things. But I wasn't kind of at Newcastle at the time, and the art school in Vienna was very different. Yeah, it was kind of isolating, but also really exciting. And from that, I realized how much was happening kind of outside of me. Loads of exhibitions celebrating Black artists were happening across the globe. I was just quite far removed and hadn't known like where to look.
So yeah, so it sounds like your work, in addition to kind of focusing on yourself and your family, that having conversations with other artists, faculty, and that kind of thing were important in terms of creating the foundation for your work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe the artists, maybe writers, or concepts or experiences that that are important to you and or your work.
Okay, I'll start with artists.
Yeah.
So I really like Kerry James Marshall's work.
Mhm.
I like how he explores Black life and isn't limited to just one way of working. His practice has been quite broad. And I'd say that that's something I do. Maybe you could say I kind of work in series. I'm exploring an idea, a thought, a news cycle, and I make work about that. And then when that's done, I kind of move on to something else. Um, and as artists, people kind of like you to do the same thing over and over again. So I really look at him as a way of breaking the mold and changing expectations, really. Other artists are Toyin Ojiodutola, Ndujeka Akinyele Crosby. I still really like Lucian Freud, just the way he handles paint. And Alice Neal, the way she captured her community so wonderfully. Writers, these are all actually American. I really enjoy Claudia Rankin, the way she speaks about race and explains it so clearly, and how she uses personal stories to kind of bring it back to self rather than big theoretical ideas. Isabella Wilkinson, just started reading her book, really enjoying that. And then I read a lot of novels as well, which help to think of ways to kind of tell a story. What else did you ask about? Oh, and ideas.
Yeah.
I lived experiences and the news cycles really influence my work. Yeah, just to stay grounded and relevant to our times, I find that to be really helpful.
Yeah, so I kind of had a kind of hidden agenda in terms of asking about your influences, because I read an interview where you said the Claudia Rankine was the most well-thumbed book that you had, and so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why, like which book of hers is well-thumbed, and why her work in particular speaks to you.
Okay, so they're kind of blurring, but what was I think the first one I read, is it Just
Just Us, yeah.
Just Us?
Just for
Yeah.
Us, yeah,
Yes, Just for Us. That was the
Yes.
first of her books that I read.
Yeah, yeah.
And my mind was blown. That one is very well thumbed. I was also at the Ruskin in Oxford when I read that, and we had to present an idea to the class, and her book was what I chose. I read a segment and kind of brought it back to what we were talking about. I think that was really transformative because it was in the wake of Black Lives Matter. I was at Oxford during the pandemic, and they were thinking about ways to make the school, I guess, more diverse, more diverse, and kind of tackle issues surrounding race and identity. And that was, I found that my classmates like were able to absorb what she was talking about quite easily. And her second book, I think it's the second book, a bigger one. I can't remember the name. I'm very sorry.
Citizen? Is it Citizen?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
okay,
That one
yeah.
is also very well thumbed. I just think she's a great writer.
Okay.
And I feel like I came to her quite late,
Yeah.
which was disappointing for me, but very enjoyable.
And I see lots of resonances in terms of her work and your work in the focusing on the importance of the quotidian, right? The everyday, things that people basically overlook, right, on a regular basis, and that it, requires us, if we're going to really be invested in these expansive notions of humanity that will include Blackness, right? That we have to actually broaden our perspective. So kind of relatedly, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the format and the style of your paintings, because I'm really struck with the fact that you do these large scale paintings, and they're huge, right? So they take up a lot of space on the wall. And traditionally, that format is coded as masculine and mainstream, right? So think of like, Pablo Picasso, Lucian Freud, right? And folks like that who do these huge paintings. And so I wonder about that format and why, you're choosing to work in that format in particular, and what it means to see Black bodies, historical Black bodies, as well as contemporary Black bodies, in these huge, large scale paintings.
Yeah, well, you kind of just said it right there. It began with an idea of taking up space, filling up a gallery wall, being present. But I also really just enjoy working on a large scale. And as I began my career in art school, I had so much energy. I don't know where it came from. But some of those paintings were 250 centimeters wide, some 3 meters. And I just really enjoyed the challenge of being able to create something like that. I've started to work on a smaller scale sometimes now because, it's nice to finish a painting in a week as opposed to months.
As opposed to
months.
But
really, the large scale, I just find easier for kind of storytelling. It's easier to fit multiple figures into a scene, and kind of just easier to work with. I'd say they're kind of life size, sometimes larger.
Life size. Oh yeah. And then I mean, the colors are just fabulous, and the way that they are. Could you, talk about the actual process and how you're deciding to situate, the figures, within the paintings, when you are installing your shows, like the Frieze London, what kinds of things are you thinking about in terms of where the paintings are and how you see them in conversation with the space and the audience that's coming in? So those kinds of questions.
Okay, so color is just something that comes to me really instinctively. And I always try to make the kind of work that I wanted to see. And I feel like color really draws the viewer into the work. I began my practice kind of thinking about my Nigerian heritage as well, and the Found family photographs, and color was a big part of the clothing and textiles. So that's where the use of color and bold backgrounds and sometimes patterns really began. And that kind of just became my way of working. As for the figures, so I don't work from life. The figures come from photographs or archival material. And I will just kind of take the figure and recomposition them with other things that kind of tell the story. So a person in an image might be a starting point, and I'll think about what story I want to tell, and I'll just find other images online and kind of collage them together in PowerPoint to create the scene. So the scene isn't the painting, but it helps me to get the figures to scale in contrast to each other. So if someone's standing, I know that the other person kind of needs to be half the size, and so on. And that's kind of how the painting is built. I print the image off and I grid it onto the canvas, which is a very old school way of transferring. The printed image is kind of divided into 16 squares, and the canvas is divided into 16 squares, and then I transfer it on. At the beginning, I was kind of too scared to paint backgrounds and didn't consider them to be very important. So it tended to just be a block color. But as my confidence grew, I thought about ways to situate the figures in a time period, because without a background, you kind of don't know if it's contemporary or old. Maybe the clothing helps to tell. But I thought I needed to be a bit more intentional about the stories I was telling. So began to do further research and create scenes that way. Sometimes I'll paint a painting and realize something's missing, and I'll find an image of a plant or a stool or a globe and kind of just paint it in. But I can't paint for my imagination. Like, the scenes are sometimes imagined, but I've created a real thing before I paint. I wish I was a bit more able to do that. In terms of exhibitions, sometimes as I'm working, I have a really clear idea of how I want the show to be read. Maybe there's a timeline story within the works, or sometimes somewhere like Frieze, you're kind of limited with free walls, and I'll pick a color for the background, for the wall, that's something that bounces off the paintings and accentuates it that way. Yeah, it's really instinctive, and normally as the paintings are coming together, I'm able to think a bit more about the exhibition and how I want it to look.
Thank you so much. So great hearing about the thoughtfulness and engagement of your process. And it just occurred to me that we should probably show some paintings. Kate, could we see the first painting in the slideshow? I don't remember the title of this one, but it's of the gentleman wearing the turban, yeah. And the background. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this, because it seems to connect to some of what you've just been saying in terms of your process and working with like the background and working with historical images.
Yeah, so an art historian knew that I was interested in like Black figures from history, and she gave me a list of them. This man is called Nigel Barron's Footman, and when I initially painted him, I thought he was a figure of prominence, but this is actually his servant's outfit, which I found to be extraordinary. The original painting is actually on view in the Tates, in the permanent collection.
Oh, wow.
But I just kind of wanted to celebrate his presence and bring him to life as not a servant. There's not so much known about him, but I thought that it was important that he is a Black man that lived and is more than just a servant. Yeah.
And
sorry.
No, go ahead.
So the original painting had him in front of some clouds, and I decided to make him a bit more grand. And I found a textile print from the 18th century when he was alive and used that as the background.
Super, super cool. I mean, I'm wondering about, and it feels like it connects to the portrait of Ignatius Sancho that you do later. That I think it feels like in the original portrait, he's kind of like an accessory, right? To
Yes.
His I don't know whether he was actually enslaved or not, but he's clearly an accessory, right? And that's what the kind of the dress, the fancy dress, is supposed to kind of communicate, right? That he's an accessory. But I think when you put him in this kind of format, right? It feels much more like Sancho's portrait, right? Where he
Yes.
is, right? The focus is on him as an individual, not him as, an object, right? That's subject to someone else.
Yeah,
So
correct.
yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to do. It feels
Mhm.
strange because it is kind of an existing work, but yes,
Mhm.
you're right. He isn't celebrated. He isn't at the forefront. And by doing this, he is. Also, a lot of people didn't know about the original work, and kind of bringing it back into the mainstream kind of reintroduces people to their histories and the forgotten, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, and you do something similar with the Frances Barber portrait, which is the next one in the slideshow, where this one is a little bit different in that he's not shown with an enslaver in the original, but he's kind of aestheticized in the original, right? Where it
Yeah.
feels like the point was to kind of, focus on how the original painter had worked with the skin color, right? Where as this one looks that, when it crops right down so very closely to his face, it feels like it's really focusing on him as an individual, right, and not so much as a as a study or as
Yeah.
a servant. So, wondering if you wanted to say a little bit about this one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think at the time, well, it's kind of surprising that a lot of these figures had professional portraits made of them by like renowned artists. And it does, it is mainly because they had a fascination with the skin and I guess with their very existence. Yeah, I came across Francis Barber when researching all of these figures really and found him extraordinary once again. He was enslaved, I believed, and then Thomas, no, not Thomas Gainsborough, um, Samuel, oh, I've forgotten his surname, but the man
John
who wrote,
Johnson.
yes, Samuel Johnson, ended up taking him in and raising him, and he inherited Samuel Johnson's fortune. And I just found his story and lived experiences so fascinating. And again, I hadn't heard anyone speaking about him and wanted to bring him to the forefront. I think he appears again. Oh no. Oh, he isn't in this one, but I also painted him with his imagined wife. I don't believe there's an image of her.
Okay.
But I kind of reimagined what their lives would be like and painted a full-length portrait of him.
Awesome. I wonder if we could go to slides 6, 7, 8, and 9. So these are the slides from is it London Frieze or Frieze London?
No, these are from Chapter Gallery in Cardiff.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And the
So
exhibition, oh, sorry.
yeah, no, you go
No,
ahead. You describe the exhibition. Yeah.
it was titled Ode to Oluwado Equiano.
Mhm.
And that was because the image in the last slide of this presentation is what is put on his book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oluwado Equiano. And I started the painting, which was to be the lead image of the exhibition based on that image. But upon doing more research, I realized it wasn't him. It was the painting is just called Man in a Red Jacket, but it's kind of made to be him. And I thought that that was really unfortunate that this person existed. There is an image of him, but it's kind of been accepted to use somebody else's image as him. So that's where the title of the exhibition came from. And then the other figures that are included are figures from history, kind of reimagined, people that I'd read about that didn't have images that I'd reimagined. And then with this, the bright blue painted walls just seemed very fitting for historical paintings of the time. And I just kind of wanted to have fun and maybe take people back in time.
Yeah, and I just love these images and how they are challenging, right? Our understanding of 18th century Black folks in England in particular, right? And I love the image of the family clearly in the back and the portrait of, this is Equiano on the left.
Yes,
And I'm
the
not
real
sure.
Equiano.
Yeah. And so actually, Kate, could you go all the way to the back to the last image on the slideshow? So just to show folks that uh, that this is the image that she was talking about. So this is the one. It's actually also, or at least it used to be on the cover of Vincent Corretta's autobiography of Equiano, which I think is hilarious because this is not, as Joy points out, right, Equiano. So if we could go back to the blue portraits, but so those, I mean, it just feels like there's like a conversation kind of going on amongst these paintings. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to the historical paintings and you know, what your process was, you know, what your thinking is in terms of, you know, your engagement with these images from Black British history, which we don't always, right, know, you know, a lot of details about.
Sure. So I began the historical paintings following George Floyd's murder. Up until that point, my work had been quite contemporary, mainly thinking about ways to fill in the gaps on gallery walls and celebrating the joy in Black life, the everyday. But following George Floyd's murder and the discussions that were being had, I realized that people, well, mainly people in Britain, just didn't know the history. And I realized that I didn't either. There's the story that's told to us is that Black people first arrived in Britain on the Windrush in 1948. And before that point, there wasn't a person of color in sight. It was just white. And I knew this wasn't true, but I didn't know what the truth was. So I started reading. David Olusoga's book, Black and British, A Forgotten History, was a great starting point and introduction to the forgotten history. I learned about people such as Sarah Forbes Bonetta, Ignatius Sancho, Oluwado Equiano, and so many other people. And my mind was just blown that, you know, that the curriculum in school had just kind of deemed this knowledge as not important enough and not worth being mainstream. And my view was kind of like, if it was taught in schools and if more people knew, there would be greater understanding to race relations today and how Britain specifically came to be Britain. I just feel like by excluding so much history, it does so much harm and it's really dangerous. To me, looking at the historical figures is kind of doing the same thing I'm doing with the contemporary works. It's just coming at it from a different angle. So again, it's about celebrating Black life, filling in the gaps, and, you know, just kind of extending our view. I kind of hoped that the exhibition would be a starting point, so to speak, so that curious people can go and read a bit more and learn who these figures are. So there was a text that was commissioned by Orlando Reed, which kind of explains my journey to get to that point. And we included a reading list, but hopefully also just beautiful paintings that kind of draw you in. And the hope is that people go on further to explore. So this exhibition came about because I had two exhibitions at the same time, one in Lagos, Nigeria, and one in Cardiff. For the show in Lagos, Nigeria, I did nudes, exploring the Black female body. And for the show in Cardiff, I chose to do historical works. I hoped that both would kind of have the same impact, but they were definitely dedicated to the space that they were shown in. If the nudes were shown in Cardiff, I don't think there would have been not that shock is the aim, but it wouldn't have started conversations in the same way as they did in Lagos. And if these works were shown in Lagos, it also wouldn't have started conversations in the same way that they have here, because Nigerians, I can't speak for all Nigerians, but they know their history and they're not too concerned about what happens in Britain. And the concept of race and racism kind of blows their minds living in a Black majority country. So it was very fitting that the exhibition was in Cardiff. and that I got to tell this story, I included elements from the time, such as like fashion. There's shoes included in the slide, images of historical books, just to kind of set the scene. And not pictured here, I also painted the ocean, the waves. I read In the Wake by Christina Sharp, and you know, at the same time as reading the interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano and the power that the sea had, taking these enslaved people from place to place, I just thought that it was really fitting to kind of include all of these things together to set the scene and place these figures in a time in history.
Thank you. That's so lovely. I absolutely love this painting. It's one of my favorites of yours. I love the color, and I just love I love the shoes. And people who know me know I love shoes. But beyond that, it's just, and the detail is absolutely fantastic. And it kind of reminds me of the shoes in the portrait of Frances Williams. Where I know they're not like, they're kind of the same kind of style with the big, huge buckles and that kind of thing. And so I was wondering if you could maybe talk about this particular, because right, there's no body in this one, right? And so for me, I'm wondering, whose shoes are these? What were they doing, right before? Are they getting ready to put them on, or did they take them off? Like, so I'm wondering what your thoughts were in terms of creating this image in particular.
Interesting. So to make some of the works, I had to look at Thomas Gainsborough's works, who was a painter working at the time, because photography didn't exist, and I kind of needed a way to understand the fashions, how people lived, what they wore, and just kind of understand the time period that I was interested in. And I noticed that in his paintings, a lot of the figures are wearing these shoes. They're called straights. And I think I read that they were very painful. People's feet couldn't move, like bend within them. And I think I was just fascinated by that's just what people wore and how they lived. And by how uncomfortable and unpleasant they kind of seem in terms of actually wearing them, but how beautiful the actual footwear is. And then I was experimenting with layering color for the background. It was the first time I'd done this. I think it was a brown first with an orange on top, and just experimenting with texture and
it's just gorgeous. So thank you for sharing this painting. So I wonder if we could talk about your work in relation to archives and notions of archiving, because you've already talked a little bit about the role that your own archives, right, play in the creation of the more contemporary work, and how some of the historical work is kind of going through historical archives, right, to kind of challenge, right, these representations. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more on whether, you see your work as offering a kind of counter narrative to ways that we understand the archive, or are you interested in kind of having a new conversation about archives and process of archiving?
Yeah, for me, it's something of the two. So for the contemporary work, the everyday, the celebrating Black life, I hope that will kind of act as a recording of the present times, the same way I referred to Gainsborough to understand the everyday present times of that time. I hope that maybe my work can be referred to in the same way. Alongside film and music, I just think that if people in the future only look at perhaps old newsreels or newspapers to understand what Black life was like, they would get an incomplete telling. Only the bad would be recorded in that way. So I hope the contemporary adds to the positive imagery of Black life. With the archival work, I guess for me that's more kind of filling in the blanks and celebrating also Black life. Some of the paintings aren't true. So the family that we saw in an earlier image of the slideshow, they didn't actually exist. It's an imagined family of Ignatius Sancho, so to speak. And sorry, Equiano. So I don't know how historically accurate they can be, but yeah, I hope to fill in the gaps and tell a different story.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see resonances between descriptions in, Ignatius Sancho's letters, and his descriptions of his family and this portrait in particular, right? I know there are different individuals, right?
Yeah.
But this is a lot of Equiano. But the focus in Sancho's letters on domesticity, right, as being, within his realm, as a Black British man, right? That he's not
Yeah.
somehow exempted from the same kinds of domestic kind of quotidian experiences that the majority of 18th century
Yeah.
British white folks are
Yes,
having.
definitely. And his
Yeah.
letters actually did play a part. The painting on the right is what I imagine Sancho's wife to be.
Aw.
She is a Black woman, and I found a letter with a friend of mine of Sancho describing his wife, and he described her as, she's my wife and truly my best part. And that's what I titled the painting. Yeah, so there's elements of historical truth to these kind of imagined paintings.
Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, they might not be recorded in history in archives in the ways that we want them to, but I think that your work is really contributing to offering a much more complex picture of our understanding, right, of this time period, especially for Black British folks during the 18th century. I love this. I did not know that this was a portrait of Anne Sancho. I love it even more now because of that. But I'm wondering if we could talk maybe a little bit about diaspora, because Sancho and his wife are super interesting if we think about this question of diaspora. We know that Anne Sancho's parents were probably born in the West Indies because that's how she's described in Sancho's letters. But Anne Sancho herself was actually born in London, right? We don't know where Ignatius Sancho was born. He might have been born in Africa, might have been born on a slave ship, right? We have no idea. And then Dion Brand in her keynote talked about the movements of Equiano, and how he's going between the Caribbean and the UK up to the North Atlantic, all of these kind of journeys. And so I wonder about the role of diaspora and movement in terms of your work, and whether and how you see it is in conversation with differing notions of Blackness, maybe differing notions of Black Britishness. So yeah, how does notions of the Black diaspora, the African diaspora, contribute to or play a role in your work?
So I self-identify as British Nigerian, and here in Britain, it definitely feels like an identity within itself, kind of like a subculture in a way. And I think my earlier works and the contemporary works kind of exemplify that a bit more. British Nigerian people look at it and they recognize certain things from our shared experience. So I think that's maybe the most obvious way that it's recognizable. I think my practice as a whole speaks to Black Britishness, our place, how many of our parents were born abroad in Africa or the Caribbean, and how like a lot of my contemporaries are the first to be born in Britain. I think that has shaped my practice significantly. Sometimes people want to collect me under the African title, but I've been told that I'm actually a British artist. However, the African side seems to be a lot more generous and encompassing of who is kind of brought in under that diaspora umbrella. The British collections seem to be a lot less generous and have to kind of work a lot harder to include people of color. It doesn't seem the natural inclination, which is maybe why I feel a bit more celebrated in terms of being included in the diaspora. For me, yeah, it's an interesting question. I definitely float between the two. It's a weird place. When I'm in Nigeria, I'm told I'm too British, and like, you know, when I'm here, blackness is what's seen first. But yeah, my practice as a whole has tried to kind of understand and make sense of these identities and words that are used.
Yeah, because even the historical images, right? I know you have I think you have one of Phil Sweetley Peters, right? One of the
Yes.
Yes. So even though your particular focus is on the Black British experience, for example, that there still are these ways that the images and some of the iconography, right, that you are working with seems to draw a lot from across the diaspora.
Yeah.
So
And the
yeah.
literature I read tends to be,
Mhm.
broadly from the diaspora.
Yeah, exactly. As you were saying, right, that you were, influenced by, Claudia Rankine and Isabel Wilkerson. And I definitely see, lots of connections with that work in terms of, challenging perceptions of humanity in particular. I know that we're coming up towards the end, but I wanted to just give you an opportunity to talk about your book, which I know just came out last week, and I was chagrined to learn is not going to be available in the States until February of next year. But yeah, could you talk a little bit about the book and what the book takes up and how the book might be in conversation with some of the historical work?
Yeah, so the book is my first monograph, basically including works over the last 7 to 8 years, which has been amazing to kind of see in chronological order. And it's the first time my work has been written about in such a way. I know what I'm doing within my practice, but sometimes it does cause confusion the way I kind of go from contemporary to historical and so on. And it's kind of been a nice way to make sense of that and kind of place myself within the canon of art history. So it includes an essay by Dr. Jared Das, which explains my thought process and thinking in a much more coherent way than I could ever explain. And then I'm also in conversation with a curator called Adelaide Bannerman, who's known me since the beginning of my career. And we discuss a lot of these ideas that we've discussed here today. And then a foreword is written by Dr. Christine Chichenska, which is also really great. It just kind of gives space to explore all my thoughts and everything that I'm interested in and make sense of it. Like, it's a real gift to me, but hopefully it's a real gift also to everybody that's able to read it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we're going to start to ask, we're going to have people ask questions. So I'd like folks to just keep that in mind. And I actually want to ask about one more painting, Kate. I'm so sorry. So while folks are thinking of questions, and we've had a wide-ranging conversation, so I think there are lots of possibilities in terms of potential questions. But I wonder if and the questions, you can add them in the chat or in the Q&A. Is that right? Yes. Yes. Okay. All right. So I had a question about the image on slide number 12. So it's the horse. Yeah. And just what's going on here? I don't know this image, so I think it might be something that you've created, right, and put together. Yeah.
Yeah. So it comes from. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't remember everything.
Yeah.
but I believe it comes from I was inspired by a cartoon, a historical cartoon,
Okay.
that showed a sequence of images, and I kind of reimagined it. The painting is called A Guilty Conscience Knows No. No, sorry. Oh, sorry, the painting's emerging. It's called Get Off Your High Horse.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the bottom part of the painting is clipped, but that's a white soldier on the floor who's fallen off his horse. And the figure on the right kind of looks like what Nigel Barron would have worn.
Okay.
And he's a servant, but sometimes there's elements of humor in the work, and I hope this was one of them. Kind of reversal role play. But I can't remember what the original cartoon was. But maybe the soldier was on the horse in that image.
Yeah. I just think it, I mean, it made me smile, and I wasn't sure if I was actually supposed to be
No, you're
smiling.
supposed to smile. Yeah.
But no. So thank you for giving me permission to do that. But I love it even more now, knowing where it's coming from. And so I want to, find that historical image so I can show it to my students.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah. Oh, lovely. Thank you so much. So we have a question in the chat. The question is, thank you so much. Your use of tone is so complex, beautiful, and creates such movement in your figures. They seem alive. Absolutely. As you said, many 18th century painters were fascinated with Black skin tone and followed William Gilpin. Can you say more about your own practice with tone and how it is so different from these older white gaze practices?
Yeah, so I see color, and when I paint the skin in a very weird way where the tones are really highlighted, and it's so obvious to me that we're all made up of so many different colors to kind of read as an overall complexion. And this way of painting and how I see the color is just really instinctive. I was told that it looks like I'm painting by numbers, and in some ways it does. But it's just how I see color and skin tone. In the historical works, sometimes I am a bit more limited because the original source image is like sepia toned or grayscale. But I just work with what I have. However, the fragmented skin still kind of shows through despite that.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't know if there are other questions. Let me just check. I don't see another one, so I will ask another question. So I'm curious about gender, right? Because there is, right, a lot of the documentary evidence that we have from the 18th century particularly focuses on Black men, right? Alado Equiano, Cuguano, Ignatius Sancho, right? Francis Williams, all of that. But what I've always been struck with was your attention to gender, and that you're not just including, right, images of these Black men. You're reimagining on Sancho. You're painting. Phyllis Wheatley Peters. There's the lovely image of the Liverpool woman that you had done,
Yeah.
and then in the slideshow, there's the image on number 11, which is of this just fascinating image of a woman in this huge, I think it's Sarah Bonetta Forbes, right? Is
Yes.
that the
Yes,
portrait?
that's
Okay. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about gender and these historical images and what you might be up to with that.
So when I began looking at the historical works, the first way I was introduced to it was an existing archives called, I think, Autograph BP Collection had an exhibition a few years ago of Black figures from the 18th century. And they made a conscious effort to include like an even gender mix.
Oh, wow.
However, yeah, when I began researching, a lot of the male stories came to the forefront first, and I had to look really hard to find stories about women. So Phyllis Wheatley, I discovered her towards the end of the body of work. I didn't want it to be an exhibition of just men. Um, I've learned to be quite intentional because if someone walks in and they see just men, it's easy for them to think that only men are part of the story and part of history. So I had to really go out of my way to find the women. That was intentional. And I'm sure there's still many more women to be included. No, not Phyllis. Sarah Forbes Bonetta wasn't included in the Cardiff exhibition because I tried to keep it with the contemporaries kind of working and living around the same time. But yeah, it was outnumbered, which is why I think I had to make some people out.
Yeah. So, and I think one of the portraits that you made up, which I love, is the portrait of Equiano and Sancho when they're sitting at the table. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about how that particular image came about and what you might want people to take away from that particular image.
So that painting was included in Freeze, and I just wanted to have some fun. It was unclear. So their lives maybe overlapped by 20 years or so. They were
Yes.
both writers and abolitionists, but it's unclear whether they actually met. And I was just having some fun thinking, imagine if they were sat at a table discussing their thoughts and ideas. And I like to believe that they did meet and their paths did cross. I couldn't find any actual recollection of this. Yeah, it was slightly humorous. Again, kind of mixing up the archive. But yeah, I like the idea of them meeting.
It's a wonderfully evocative kind of possibility, and there are connections. So the church, Saint Margaret's, I think, Cathedral in Westminster. I think that's the name of it. Not cathedral. I think it just might be church. The smaller church that's by Westminster. That it where Sancho's family, that's where all of the kids were baptized. But importantly, that's where he and his wife got married. And we know the year after that Equiano was actually baptized at the same exact church. So it's possible
Wow.
that they might have, been attending church, kind of at the same time. We know that Anne Sancho, was pretty strident about attending church on a regular basis, according to Sancho. So her husband.
I like
So
that idea.
I like to think, yeah, that they might, maybe they were in the audience, when Equiano was baptized. I think that's a super evocative image there. So I know that we're almost out of time. I don't know if there might be one more question in the audience that folks might want to ask. Maybe not.
Always a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I know. And it's a Saturday, and at least here in Boston, it's cold and rainy. So yeah, Carrie,
I just wanted to say thank you from the Early
Yeah.
Caribbean Society for this wonderful conversation, for Kate, for organising with Amherst, for Nicole, for inviting, and just this has been such a rich conversation. And Joy, I don't know if you know that you allowed us to use this incredible image for the special issue on the woman of color, and Nicole had the connection, but we loved it just so much because it's just like here she is just living her life,
Mhm.
and she's not in the archives, but I love everything you've said. Thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
Okay, great. Awesome.